What if I told you that this was a random story generator? Now, normally what I'd do in this video is give you some kind of game design challenge. How can we make a role-playing game out of the website Wikipedia.com? What's obviously unfair when I do that is that I make those videos after I already have what I think is a clever idea that works. But now, this is your chance to beat me to it, because this time, I failed. I've made some weird things so far. Games with a Rubik's Cube character sheet, fortune cookie dice, fantasy novel character sheet and dice, and regular dice that constantly explode. But I think I've only cracked this one a little bit, and you might find a lot more potential beneath. Because you might think that you're just looking at Wikipedia's random article feature. But that's not quite true. You're actually looking at a very simple online tool I created because that feature just wasn't cutting it. So a while ago, when I was first coming up with things like Cube AI and the Apprentice's Grimoire, I remembered another way to randomly generate interesting information, which is Wikipedia's random article search function. The first thing I did was to try to make a game that used the whole thing. You would generate a few random articles from everything on Wikipedia, then the same way people do Wikipedia races, you could click on a few links to try to get articles you want. Then your character sheet is your browser window, with like 5 tabs that represent your character's areas of expertise. But that was boring, and way too unreliable. It was too easy to be stuck with a character who knows a lot about, like, the history of Southeast Asia, which is very interesting, but how do you make a game that's as much about that as it is about computer engineering or religious philosophy? I then drifted toward the idea of using the random articles as dice rolls. Like, when you need to find out what happens in the game, you generate the article and use something about the page to tell you what happens. But what good does that do you when you're probably going to get something like a genus of beetles? This was the beginning of using words as roll results, which eventually led to my biggest break so far, in the Apprentice's Grimoire being downloaded close to 1,000 times by now. But it just wasn't working for this Wikipedia game. Until I learned that you can actually narrow the scope of the random articles. I was really excited, at first, until I realized that it can only narrow the generation to a specific index that's usually like a weird collection of mid-level articles, not a comprehensive collection of the world's most interesting myths that could burst with random inspiration for a fantasy story. So I decided to make one. What you're looking at on screen, and can link to in the description, is what I made. A web page with one button, where if you click it, you'll be sent to one of at least 200 articles about a piece of myth or folklore that you probably haven't heard of before. There's crazy stuff in there, like Canadian flying canoe racing and a guy who's half man, half book? What does that even mean? This felt like something I could work with. But I still couldn't quite do what I wanted to, at least not yet, or at least not by myself. Even though this was now all happening after I made the Apprentice's Grimoire, I knew it wasn't going to work like that game does. That game thrives on the style of fantasy writing, and even if a Wikipedia page is about a creepy Japanese yokai, it's still going to be written like an encyclopedia entry. But then I noticed that Tim Hutchings was making a sequel to Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. Thousand-Year-Old Vampire is the only solo game I've ever gotten into. I loved how its vibe and prompts made for an interesting, introspective, but also kind of pulpy game about writing the journal of an ancient vampire. So I thought, what if that's what this game I'm working on is like? If this game is about discovering weird and obscure world mythology, what if it's a journaling game? What if you are a chronicler of strange happenings in the world, or an arcane researcher in a fantasy world inspired by the myths you're given? And because I'm ultimately not a solo RPG kind of guy, what if the game was about these characters writing letters to each other about the things they discover? So players can not only learn about the things they find, but also what the others find in their own words. I kind of felt like I couldn't leave it at that. Like, here, get a random article and then write a friend an email about it. And that's where I think I started to fail again after getting a second wind. I had all these ideas, like maybe when you get an article, it starts as the inspiration for some magical anomaly your character discovers. And then your character and their companions go on a little adventure together to deal with the anomaly and turn it into a source of power for your characters. And as you go through these rounds of writing about your discoveries and adventures, what started as a story inspired by a strange real-world myth becomes your own story and lore. But I haven't come up with a system that I think really makes that work. And it certainly hasn't worked in playtesting. If it had, then there would be a free download with this video, but as it is, there's only one nearly blank webpage. It might be that I have to admit that games where you're playing solo or aren't interacting in real time aren't really my thing, but I figure they might be your thing. So if this sounds like an interesting idea to you, I would like to see this little digital tool become actually useful in a world of tabletop RPGs that are gonna become increasingly digital. I'm sure that someone else out there will have a better idea of how to implement this than I can come up with, and if you do, please let me know in the comments. Or if nothing else, then just go nuts learning about the original ancient Hebrew sandworm. Look at that thing. Or maybe I will find a way to make it work. I'd rather focus on expanding the Apprentice's Grimoire into a full game for now, but who knows? So far, this whole thing is still just me bouncing around ideas to see what works, so we'll just see what works next. Until then, have fun.